So before we get into everything demand gen, what I wanted to do just to give the audience a little bit of context on Bionic. I've done some research on you guys, but some folks may not know who you are. So I think before we even start, just so that folks know how you guys are thinking about demand gen, what is it that Bionic does? And then ultimately, who are you guys serving in terms of like the audience? Like talk a little bit about the ICP would be great.
Yeah. So Bionic works in kind of the DevSecOps space. And so we're kind of working in a few different categories. So in the DevSecOps space, we're primarily working with like application security people, product security, DevOps personnel. So that could be either security side or automation side. But basically in the development process, there is a huge focus on automation and performance. So like how much code can we push out? How quickly can we push out code? And let's just get as many new features out there, because if you're not pushing new features, your competitors are, and therefore you're losing. And so with all the focus on like, let's change code every day, every hour, every minute, like however fast you're changing code, security falls behind. So a developer could push new code, and that code could have an API call to a third-party service that then takes data from your application and pushes it into the internet. Well, if it's not supposed to do that, or if there was no security analyst that approved that, and they don't know about it, that could be a potential new attack vector. And so that's kind of the space that we work in. We basically reverse engineer your application code and create this basically visual map that shows you basically all the potential attack surfaces. And so from an audience standpoint, when I think about this one, I'm not a very technical person. So a huge part of my job is not just obviously doing demand, but like understanding the industry, because it's a very, very technical industry with very technical people. And so that's a big part of kind of, I guess, how I'm thinking about everything on a day-to-day.
So it's apps, so app developers and managers of app teams, DevOps teams, et cetera. Those are the folks that ultimately come in for an inbound demo request. Or is it other folks?
Yeah, so it's a wide range of people. So the DevOps people are really just the tool pluggers. So they're the people who go, we're going to add this new tool. We think it's going to provide value. This is where we're going to put it in our automation process. So they're 100% focused on automation. So if they think that our tool helps with that process, then they'll come in inbound. Then we have the security folks who are focused on the actual security risks, compliance and security risks. And so they'll come in inbound, focused mainly on that. And then we have like enterprise architecture and architects. And those are the people that are building the apps and designing the apps, and then giving them to the developers to actually build. And so if they're saying, hey, we're building it in this way because we know that this follows all of our security protocols, and then a developer goes outside of those design standards, it could potentially cause a new security risk. So there's kind of a few different people that we target, and they want to use our platform for different reasons. So
that's actually an interesting segue then. So I think that, so a lot of B2B SaaS companies right now, especially in the early stage, that seed to Series B area, they've got usually two kind of big issues, right? One is who are we going after and what does our ICP definition look like? A lot of times it's very broad. It's not centered on anything, and it's just kind of very, all over the place, right? And then the other aspect is actually segmenting down that ICP and understanding like who we're actually going to go after. And I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities there. And you just rattled off a whole bunch of different folks, which I think is interesting, right? Yeah. And I think the big thing that I see, again, if B2B SaaS companies can't really take their ICP and break it down into the segments, especially given the fact that they've got limited capital, they don't have unlimited resources, they can't make content for all of these different personas, unless of course they've got something in common. I mean, how do you think about doing that, right? I mean, are you guys right now just having the same type of message across these segments, or do you break down messaging to each of them, or are you not segmenting all and it's just say, hey, like we're just trying to go after the broad ICP right now and build brand awareness around that? How do you guys think about segmentation?
Yeah, so at first we almost did no segmentation, and the reason for that was because we really didn't understand our industry that well. So I mean, I've been working here for about 5 months or so, and when I first came on, a lot of it was basically just product marketing, like let's learn what these people care about. So we kind of went after a bunch of different groups that we had assumptions about based on either, previous sales calls that our team had before we came on, interviews that we do through this app called Sage Tap, and then basically they bring in developer heavy people, pay them a certain amount of money, and then we give basically interviews to them, be like, what do you care about, what do you do day to day, etc.
Right.
And so we really started off pretty broad, and then basically looked for reaction. And we kind of found these pockets where people reacted to our product in different ways, but still kind of moved forward. So that's one way. And then the other way was, so there's people who use our products, there's people who think our product is interesting, there's people who buy our product. The people who use our product are, these like security people who are in it day to day looking at security risks. There's people who buy the product. These are the leaders of the security or leaders of architecture or leaders of DevOps, right? And then there's the people who find our product interesting and want to use our product but have no budget. So there's this kind of thing that you have to think about when you're doing demand gen, is like, you can either go for a few people, and those are the people who are your buyers. You can go for a lot of people, and you can go to the people who are going to use your product but may or may not have the power to move it up the chain, right? Or you can go to the people who understand your product and will be kind of like your cheer squad. And so a cool thing that we found was that these enterprise architects love our product, understand our product, don't have budget, but know everybody. And so we have a meeting with them, we hype them up, we get them all excited about our product, and then they bring in 4 people that are going to eventually buy the product. And so when we thought about segmentation, we're obviously thinking about it in those 3 different ways. Like, we need to obviously educate our buyers, we need to educate our users, but we also need to educate this like crucial group who can bring in everybody together. So.
So is messaging then different for each of those different groups that you just talked about? So you guys have developed out unique messages for those, and then is there a content strategy behind each of the 3 as well, or is it kind of more broad?
Yeah, so the messaging, yes, is segmented. I would say our content strategy is generalized. One, because we don't really have very many content creators. We have basically 2. And so we kind of try and make general messages that kind of work for each group. And there is a central message that does work across. Like our message is basically that in current application security, you're looking at individual components, not at the whole picture. And when you don't look at the whole picture, you miss a lot. And so we can basically take that same message and apply it to each group. So if we're writing a blog and we're talking about a holistic application map, we'll be like, if you're an application security professional, this is what you care about. If you're an enterprise architect, this is what you care about. And like, we're able to do it that way. And then obviously I post different things via social, but that's kind of our approach right now. We're looking to get into other things, hopefully coming soon, but yeah.
I think it's tough. I mean, it's tough when you've got a lot. I mean, when you've got a really small team, you've only got 2 content creators. Some of them don't even have 2, right? We're talking 1, or sometimes it's the founder or other people, especially in seed and even sometimes Series A companies. So it's tough when you've got to come up with a message. But ultimately, like, this all well too, that if you've got a really broad-based message and you're trying to apply it to all those groups, you're going to get a watered down response.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to kind of say, all right, we don't have a lot of time to focus on everyone. Where are the folks that ultimately are really feeling the pain around this and are ultimately going to come in and convert on our website and start a conversation with sales? Let's focus on really making those guys the heroes and give them everything they need. And then as we get more of that, get that engine churning, then we can start getting more budget to actually start pushing out to some of the other folks that are potentially part of the buying committee. But I think this whole concept of like early stage companies coming in and trying to satisfy every single portion of the quote unquote buying committee is just too tough. Again, in the early stage companies. So
we've been kind of finding that too. It's like, all right, who are the people who are going to buy us soon rather than later? Like who is our most likely customer at this point? Let's sell to them, and then when we get more budget, we can expand. So
yeah, exactly. I wanted to shift into something. So this is what we were talking about right before we started. But you had a post, I think it was either last week or the week before that. But basically, you had said that some of the leaders that you were following in demand gen that work at other SaaS companies were preaching about all of these different things that they should be doing from a social perspective, whether it be investing more in deep social or running paid social differently or ungating content. But a lot of them, when you actually started looking into it, we're still running the same types of plays that we all see on LinkedIn when you scroll down your news feed, which is lead gen forms to gated piece of content. And what I'm curious about is digging into maybe some of your other observations there and understanding potentially why you think that's the case. Why is there this divide between, of course, it's easier to say than to do, right?
Yeah.
But why are a lot of marketers still not leaping into that side of the way that marketing should be done, at least in your mind, is kind of how you stated that post. I'd be curious.
Yeah, I think it's a few things, and I think the main thing to focus on here is that, and we had this conversation before, is people are trying to build their own personal brand on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and so they listen to people like Chris Walker and Dave Gerhardt and like Gaetano and all the big names that we all follow on social media. And they either just copy and paste what they say, reiterate what they say, quote them, things like that, and talk about how important it is to do these new ways. When in reality, they either, one, don't feel comfortable doing them, which is totally fine. Like, doing new stuff is very difficult, especially in marketing. Or two, they don't have the buy-in internally. And so it was a tough call out, I would say. I would say it was a little bit I guess stingy of me to call it out in general, but I think it was more the point of getting people to think like, hey, you're listening to all these people, but what are they actually doing? Like, what are they actually executing on? And you have visibility into that on LinkedIn. Like, you can go to the Bionic website or go to the Bionic LinkedIn, go to posts, go to ads, and look at all the ads that I'm running. Like, I can do that for any company. And so, it's great to hear that people are trying to innovate, but being able to actually see people innovate is a whole different ballgame. Like, I can call out one, like Chili Piper. They do probably the best job from a company standpoint on social media that I can think of, at least from like a marketing tech standpoint. I don't use them, but the first person I think of when I think of potentially having some sort of easy booker on my website or for my BDR team or anything like that, it's Chili Piper. It's the first thing I think of, and it's because, one, they have a killer brand, and two, they do all these like creative things. Like, how many companies have you seen run paid ads to get people into a newsletter?
Zero. And I did notice that about them too.
Yeah,
They do a lot of that.
exactly. Like, they're doubling down on getting an audience off of LinkedIn into their email list. Like, how many demand gen marketers talk about how important an email list is, and then they don't do anything with that? Like, that's more of the stuff that I think I call out and find interesting. So
yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think what I'm seeing a lot of is that I think you're right. There's certainly a comfortability, but ultimately it comes back to, I think, what you said before, which is, what is the alignment that they have with their CEO, with the board, with some of the investors, and how do they think about running demand for the company? Because there's a lot of input that those folks have on how they think demand should be run. And especially when you've got the measure of success, a lot of times still for marketers, still being around generating leads, MQLs, or whatever name you want to give it, it doesn't matter. Then you get a lot of focus in terms of tactics on driving those things, reducing costs down to the point where it's like, hey, we met our CPL, like, this is great, now we can continue going. So ultimately, I think, what I see is that if the measure of success is not aligned all the way from the top, you've got an issue. You're not going to be able to change really the ways that you're doing things before. Two, the other thing is, a lot of bigger companies, once you're Series B, Series C, and even beyond, you've already made the investment, right, in all of these different SDRs that are following up on ebook downloads. You've made the investments in making the content and having a content team produce this at a level that, that you can start generating the level of, quantity of MQLs that you need. And when you do that, it's very hard to pull away from it. right? It's very hard to change that because that means now you need to completely change the way the organization was built. And I think that those two things, to me, I think are some of the biggest things that I see.
Yeah. And there's something to be said too. Like I have typically worked at companies that had enterprise sales. And so um,
Mm-hmm.
enterprise sales works, especially when you have a really, really high ACV. Like both companies that I've worked at the past two companies I've worked at have had six-figure ACVs. And so when
Yep.
you have that high of an ACV, you can be willing to spend money. But the issue
Mm-hmm.
is that the way that the BDRs are actually going out and getting new business meetings for their sales team. Like I said this in one of the podcasts that I had a while back, was like your BDR team could potentially be your number one asset as a demand gen marketer. If you
Mm-hmm.
equip them with good pieces of content, the right message, and a good, effective, and organic way to communicate with the people in your ICP, like there can be a really strong marriage between demand gen marketers and BDRs. You just have to be willing to actually spend time and help them and make sure what you're doing from a paid side or an organic side or a content side matches with what they're saying outbound to all these people.
Mm-hmm.
So
Do you guys have SDRs
yeah,
on
so
Bionic's
we
team?
have at our company we have our BDR team, SDR team living underneath the marketing side of things. So
Mm-hmm.
so they do a lot of prospecting, obviously, right? So they're going in
Mm-hmm.
and pulling prospects from LinkedIn Sales Navigator and pushing them into Salesforce and into outreach and doing their thing, right? I take all the people that
Mm-hmm.
they prospect into and create contact lists and upload them into LinkedIn and hit them with brand awareness. So now they're getting
Hmm.
emails, phone calls, text messages, LinkedIn messages, and brand awareness ads from us. So I'm adding an additional
Hmm.
touch with videos of our demo um, and like static images that have messages that align with who they are. And so now it's helping them do their job better because they're obviously setting them 4 touches or 8 touches or whatever. Plus they're getting 6 to 8 touches from my brand awareness ads.
Have you noticed though, I don't know if you have the data on this, where those SDRs have been running outbound sequences before, and then you had some data to understand what conversion rates look like from an outbound email perspective. And then when you started really turning on some of those brand awareness campaigns and targeting the exact same companies the SDRs are going after, to see over time if there's been an overall uplift, right? Because one would think, just based on pure frequency, right? Frequency builds trust, that if they start seeing the brand out there, they're receiving great content. They're like, oh yeah, I've heard of this company. Like there's this guy, Liam, they just reached out to me. Like, what does he want? Well, I heard of Bionic before. I think I saw one of their ads the other day, and them actually responding. Have you guys looked at the data at all to see if there's been any uplift in that?
So there has been, but what I'll say is we also focused our efforts from an outbound standpoint on LinkedIn about the same exact time. So it's really hard to
Mm,
tell like whether it was the ads
yep.
or if it was our LinkedIn first approach.
Hmm.
But we have like probably 3 months of data, so we'll continue to see if it works, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of content, I guess we've always got to talk about it because it seems to be the thing that constantly is argued about all the time. But going back to kind of our point about, a lot of people, I mean, if you look at the LinkedIn newsfeed, predominantly all you see is gated downloads, predominantly lead gen forms, some website conversions, and pulling people to a website and trying to pixel them, et cetera. But what do you see as the reason? I mean, does gated still have a place? I mean, I think that the whole LinkedIn community seems to have taken a complete right turn and said gated no more. It never should be used. And I'm curious if you have a different perspective on that. Do you feel like there is a time and a place for gated pieces of content? Or do you think it's completely unnecessary and we should completely walk away from it and just take a right turn and go down the other direction?
Um, so I have to gate one thing on my website, and that's the Gartner reports, but it's because like we're
Hmm.
legally required to gate them.
Yep,
If
exactly.
we're gonna have them on downloads. So that's one place. I'm actually working with Gartner on trying to use their research in a different way right now, because a lot of people, if you look on on LinkedIn and other websites and all that stuff, people are using like their research, not just like the magic quadrants, not just like the cool vendor reports or anything like that. Like their actual research that mentions something that aligns with what they do, and they're doing like gated content downloads with like Gartner's research. And I literally told Gartner, I said, like, how do you sell this to people? Because I don't see any value in promoting someone else's content just to collect people's data. Like it makes no sense to me. So that's literally the only time I would say gated content is 100% worth it. Now you could make a argument for gated content is worth it if you have like proprietary research and you want to know who's reading your research.
Like Gong, for example. I mean, Gong gates a lot of stuff, but they also have a really strong brand already, so there's that to take into consideration.
I just don't know how. So first of all, Gong has a lot of research. Yeah. I've been seeing a lot of negative reactions from Gong's research. Like they posted something the other day that said, or at least a couple weeks ago, maybe, that said, you close more deals when you cuss more. I get it. It's a an attention grabber, but there was a really big negative reaction on social about that one.
I think they probably pulled that from Gary Vee or something from a post and just said, hey, Gary Vee's doing it. He's successful. He cusses a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, like if they wanted to gate their research, great. I think I'm speaking more like if you're using like user data, and you're like talking about user data, that's one way to gate it. But I don't know. I still am so anti gating content. I forgot who said this. I want to say maybe it was Gaetano or somebody else. But they basically were like, imagine if you went to, like an e-commerce store and you wanted to go see the price of like a bike that you wanted to get. And you had like the normal bike was, $99, and the next level up bike was $199. And then you went to like the best bike and it says like, contact sales. It's like, imagine if you like did that on an e-commerce store. It makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of like going back to that, like it's the same thing with content. Imagine if you went to, an e-commerce website and there's a bike list, like a breakdown of all the different bikes and the descriptions and the specs and all that stuff, that you had to like give them your information in order to get all that stuff. Like I've never seen that before. So I don't know. I'm just against it. If you're creating content, you're creating a gate to have people see the content. It doesn't really make sense.
Agreed. And I think it's especially true, I think, with early stage companies that don't have a lot of brand. People already don't have a lot of trust with gated content in the beginning anyway, because they don't know who you are. They don't necessarily trust your content. So you're already making it more difficult for them to even consume the content that you're trying to communicate out to them. I think proprietary research is probably the only thing that I think sometimes makes sense. But again, early stage, wouldn't recommend it, because again, like we need more consumption on that content early on than just trying to pull a few emails out. And frankly, overall, a lot of content downloads, after talking with tons and tons of B2B SaaS demand gen leaders, they're seeing decreasing effectiveness, even if the content's good. I mean, they're just not getting as many downloads as they once were before. And also you got to think that LinkedIn's algorithm is optimizing for the people that want to read or want to download some of those things. So you're also missing out on a potential opportunity where, your market, there's a market of people that are not people that download a lot of content and click on those things, right? And if LinkedIn's algorithm is optimizing for all those folks only, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's one thing that I wanted to break down too. So in terms of LinkedIn, in terms of like content and stuff like that, I saw that you guys ran I don't know if it was retargeting or prospecting or how you guys did it, but I'm curious how you guys broke it down. But there's been a number of different SaaS companies that have been running different plays where they've been incentivizing a demo. And I think this is always a topic of conversation. Conversation ads I've seen used to do this as well, where they may take intent-based data from G2, or it maybe just be a pure cold, pure cold list that they're going after and sending a message ad out to them. Then I saw you guys had run an actual just regular static 1-by-1 on LinkedIn. Maybe you guys ran it on other channels. But curious, like to understand, like what, number one, like how did you think about building that campaign and who should be doing these types of things, these strategies, and what times do they make sense or not? And then I'm additionally curious, were there any good results from it? Did you guys drive a lot of demos? And then did you see still a strong conversion rate through the funnel? I'd be curious just to kind of break that down a bit.
Yes, we've only been running it for about 3 weeks, and our sales cycle is incredibly long. And so
Yeah.
can't really see the effects of like after the first meeting yet, because we are starting to have our first meetings like this week, basically, or a little bit last week
Nice.
into this week. My initial reasoning for wanting to do it was I wanted to get people into our product and seeing our product, because I think the biggest thing that I saw from like all of our interview calls with that company called SageTap is we would ask them all these
Mm-hmm.
questions, and then we'd be like, so like if there was this tool that you could build that hypothetically did this, like basically kind of leading them into thinking about how Bionic built its tool and what it does, and then being like, okay, so you're saying like if this was a tool that existed, you would want to use it, right? And they're like, yeah, of course. Then we'd hop into a
Yeah.
demo, they'd see the demo, they'd be like, like, how long have you guys been around for? Like, did I miss it? Like, what's going on? And so we found like if we can just get the people into the demo talking about this, like how we can use it, it's incredibly effective. And I basically did my, like LTV CAC analysis and like what's my cost per lead need to be. I'm only targeting people on LinkedIn that would actually be a buyer or one of those enterprise architects type people. So I know that at least I'm in the right realm of who would buy the product. And my cost per lead is so low that it's worth giving them $100 basically if they show up. So that was kind of my thought process. The people who should do it are people who have high ACVs. If you have a low ACV, this makes no sense to do. The only investment that this would be for you is basically like a product marketing play. If you have too low of an ACV, because it ends up, unless you have like the best product in the world that every single one converts into a customer, which is obviously highly unlikely. It doesn't make sense. It's more of a getting the awareness out there, getting people into your tool, getting feedback, and plus enough people will convert into customers that basically, if I close 3 customers out of this campaign over the course of the year, I'm already 3x.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure you know Jason over at Metadata,
Yeah.
but he did an interesting test on leveraging, I think it was like $100 DoorDash gift card or something like that.
Yeah.
And they did that through conversation ads, and they ran it over, I think, over the course of months. So they had enough time for some of those leads to actually create into pipeline or to revenue. But what they found is that the conversion rates were not very good, but the learnings from it were that they were able to get a lot more people exposed to the product. To your point, they were able to get a lot more feedback, and they could drive that back into the product team to say, hey, what are marketers thinking about this, and get exposure to new features that they're releasing, et cetera. And then what they did notice is that there were still some people that actually came back into the funnel later, and they said they may have not converted into an opportunity right after that first call or second call, but they actually came back some months later and said like, hey, I was really thinking about you guys. Like, I really enjoyed the demo before. Would love to have a conversation, right? So I think there's a time and a place for those things. I think you just need to think about it in the right angle, because a lot of folks just see these things as, hey, give the offer, get the demo, and then immediately have that converting opportunities, and it can happen. But I think at least what we've seen with a lot of the SaaS companies we work with, plus after hearing Metadata's story as well, I'm kind of seeing the same thing where conversion rate's never as high. But I'd love to hear your story. Maybe it's different for you guys. Maybe you guys end up driving a much higher conversion rate, and people are interested. Because again, it depends on the audience a lot too. Some folks are a lot more used to some of these offers, whereas I think yours, much more technical dev, compliance, security.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not as much a thing.
Yeah.
So
I think that the other thing you have to think about too is I think it's pretty easy to get marketers into meetings, because marketers are always trying to figure out what that next tool is. They're always trying, for me, like I'll take a demo with basically anything, because I need to know what the tool landscape is out there. In order for me to be the best marketer that I can, I have to know what the landscape looks like, right? These technical folks hate being in meetings. And so if you can do anything to get them into a meeting with you, and you know that your product is good, it's pretty much like you might as well do it. We had an interview with I think it was a director of DevOps, and we basically asked him like, how can we get your attention? He was like, you can't. We're like, what do you mean? He's like, you literally can't get my attention. Like maybe swag, or if I go to a conference and I see your booth and I think it's interesting, that's the only way to get my attention. And so we were like, all right. So that's what fueled like my first campaign of giving away t-shirts for demos. And the cost was like, it was like $500 meetings basically, which is pretty good for a $100 ACV or $100,000 ACV. But I was like, I wonder if I, drive, with these gift cards, if it can lower, and it did. So that was kind of what fueled it. So.
Interesting. Yeah, good stuff. I wanted to, again, change directions, and we're almost at the top of the hour here. So one thing that, that I'm seeing that's still constantly an issue with a lot of marketing teams is ultimately, how they're actually trying to define the success metrics for what they're actually doing from a marketing perspective. There's all of the attribution problems that we have with running different types of programs on paid social and other channels. There's the whole dark social issues with understanding, what's the attribution from a podcast or community or all these other different sources. But ultimately, I think the big thing is, when you have a CEO board or investor group where you yourself, you're the head of demand gen for Bionic, and you've got to say, hey, here's the plan for the next 90 days, or here's the plan for the next 180 days, and here's how we're going to be measuring it. What does that conversation look like? Because I think a lot of marketers could probably benefit from maybe your thoughts on that. If you've learned anything over the past, or some mistakes even that you've made when you start to set up those conversations to make sure that, number one, everyone's on board with your plan and how you're thinking about doing demand gen and how you're going to measure it. And then ultimately what you end up actually presenting to them. So I don't know, have you been in those conversations much, I guess, recently, just being the head of demand gen for Bionic, or any thoughts there?
So I got pretty lucky. Coming here, the CMO that I work under was my CMO at my previous company. And he knew that my background was primarily SEO before working at Bionic. And so he was like, hey, do you want to come, you can basically be the person that runs demand gen. And it'll be a place where you can basically, learn and mess up and try new things and kind of be creative. And I was like, yeah, I'm there. So I got kind of lucky in that sense.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah.
Sounds like a dream. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Every marketer would kill for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I basically came to Bionic with, hey, this is how I want to do stuff. And he was basically like, sounds good. And so when I was like, hey, I want to use 50% of my budget on brand awareness, he was like, all right, sounds good. I know that other marketers are going to hear that and be upset about it, but
no doubt.
Yeah. But yeah, I got a pretty good amount of buy-in right away. And he fought, pretty hard for me right away. But in all honesty, our CEO is like, we need to spend more on marketing. Like we need to continue to get our name out there. And so in terms of like the conversations that I've had, it was more like, hey, this is how much interaction we get when we push out these types of ads. Hey, this is the type of topics that work. Like, here's how I want to do it. And it's been all pretty much like, sounds good. Go ahead and go to work. So for me,
well, I guess getting into it. So, some of the metrics though. So, you guys are running some type of lead gen stuff and trying to get demos straight from paid social. I saw,
yeah.
I think when you think about it, are you, I guess, thinking about, driving demand through some of the things with LinkedIn and paid social and lead gen, and saying, hey, it's just based on the engagement of the actual content itself, and saying, hey, here's what our CTR looks like, or here's how many people got to the website, or here's how far they got down to the page, and looking at those types of metrics? Or are you saying ultimately like, hey, in the long run, like these are some of the high level things that are happening. We've overall seen inbound demo requests increase by say 20, 30%. We've seen pipeline increase by X amount, et cetera, so that we know that the model's working. What ultimate metrics are you guys aligning on?
Yeah. So for the LinkedIn lead gen stuff, I'm pretty much looking at like cost per lead, and then how many of those leads actually turn into booked meetings, because obviously we can't see the lagging metric of POCs right now. So for us, our pipeline is whether or not we get someone into a POC, because that's the metric that ultimately gets to like that 25 to 35% close rate.
Right.
And so it's more predictable once we get to that point. And so I can't exactly like get to that pipeline metric until we actually get some people into that pipeline metric. So I'm basically trying to recreate like, all right, who are the people that were in that pipeline metric before? all right, so like how many, meetings did it take? How long did it take? How many meetings do I need to book in order to get our pipeline metric to where it needs to be? What's our cost per lead need to be? So I'm basically being like, hey, if we can get below $1,000 cost per lead, then we're in a good spot. Especially if we're just driving the right people to meetings.
Do you guys look at it channel by channel? I mean, are you going in and saying like HubSpot or Salesforce said this, or is it more looking at it on a broad scope? Or how do you guys think about like, hey, LinkedIn, we ran these types of programs. Are you trying to attribute that back into the CRM, or how do you think about that practically speaking?
Yeah, we will. It's still very early on. Like we don't even have like a marketing automation tool yet, so we're super we're super early right now.
Baby steps.
Yeah.
Baby steps.
So a lot of what we're doing is all manual. So I'm just literally living in spreadsheets and making sure all this stuff makes sense from a costing standpoint. But yes, in the long run, we'll look at, hey, we ran 3 months of these ads. They drove 15, demo requests or whatever inbound. Let's look at, let's try some new ad copy. Let's try some new videos. Let's try some new stuff on LinkedIn. Did it increase or decrease? Yeah. Why did it increase or decrease? Let's look at the lagging or the leading metrics of like click-through rate and clicks and interactions and awareness and cost and all that stuff going in that way. So we'll get there eventually. It's just, it's so early stage. Like we didn't start running ads until November. And so, yeah.
Cool. Well, cool, man. Any questions for me?
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously we've been interacting a little bit on LinkedIn back and forth, and I'd love to hear like your experience of, running Omni Lab and your demand agency of like, what's the most consistent thing that you see across most of your clients, the people you work with, the people that you're prospecting into, of like what their number one issue is in demand gen?
Right now it's content, ultimately, for the folks that we work with. And I think it's probably one of the more challenging things, especially when you're a seed to Series B company, or even, Series A, certainly. Content's difficult. And I think a lot of the issues is not just generating the content, because a lot of folks will try to end up outsourcing that to someone to create an ebook or a guide or something like that. But a lot of times that content falls flat because ultimately the people that were creating it weren't close enough with the customer. So the biggest thing for us is really just saying like, how do we get our hands on really great content that's long form? We can actually cut it up and distribute it. So, 100%, that's the thing that always stops us a lot of times. So it becomes, how can we, navigate that and give them some more specific advice on, hey, these are the types of content pieces you should be creating. Ultimately, they've got to be the expert in their customer, right? Because if they're not, then the content's not going to resonate and no one's going to care about it. So I say that's probably one of the biggest things. The other thing that I think they challenge with as well, especially in this early stage area, is the RevOps side of it. So I think that, a lot of folks, really want to try to understand, hey, what's driving revenue and what's driving pipeline, but some of them aren't really set up in the back end of the CRM. To your point about marketing automation, big point. A lot of these guys aren't running sophisticated marketing automation flows or anything like that. Not necessarily that I even believe that they really truly need to be. But the point is that a lot of the things are just not being tracked properly in the CRM. So a lot of times we'll come in and try to give some level of advice. We're not a RevOps agency, but we'll try to generally set up things so that we understand the impact that we're giving to some of our clients. But I'd say that those two are probably the biggest ones. There's a handful of others, but ultimately I think it's, making sure that they're aligned around the idea that, hey, this isn't always about just, popping out a lead out of all of these channels and looking at each channel in a silo, right? We really need to look at the aggregate funnel and understand what we're doing, because if we're going to run some of the things that we're doing where it's, more brand awareness, more ungated content, where we're not necessarily going to always have easy attribution on capturing that person right out of LinkedIn, then there needs to be that understanding. And I think sometimes that's a difficulty as well for some CEOs, because if you've got a sales background as a CEO, you're just a little bit more used to, dollars in, dollars out. And you want to know that like, hey, I put $15,000 in LinkedIn and then I got something out of it. And I think sometimes that can work for some SaaS companies, but many times based on especially more enterprise motions, I think that can be harder based on some of the tactics and strategy you're trying to run. So I'd say that those are probably the biggest three that we see.
Yeah. I saw that definitely at past companies that I worked for. They basically, they're like, hey, if we're, spending $15,000, then I need to get at least 45K out of it in revenue, because if I don't, then my margins are off. And it turns into this cyclical thing of like, all right, what's something that I can spend $15,000 on that's going to pop out 45 grand? And then you start plateauing and you're like, what's going on? And then you get fired or you get moved or whatever. And yeah, it's crazy.
Exactly. Or the other thing is that they over-index on things that are easily trackable. And I think, we look in the back end of HubSpot and it's usually paid search, organic, and direct, right? They're always the top conversions.
Yeah.
So then you say, okay, great. Word of mouth must be working. Everyone's just hearing about it somehow. We don't know how, but it's word of mouth, right? So like that's not associated with any channel. Organic, a lot of times the conversation is, well, that's SEO. SEO must be kicking ass and doing their job. And then, then you've got, other stuff that's going on too. So I think that's definitely a challenge to kind of make sure that we have alignment again from the point that going back to what we talked about earlier. If we don't have that alignment from the beginning on what we're actually trying to accomplish, then it's just very difficult to run the type of demand gen plays, at least that we want to run. Yeah. Otherwise, then you re-roll back to saying, all right, we gotta capture email addresses or do something to kind of prove prove the channel's working.
Yeah, so, definitely.
Well, cool, man. We'll love it. We'll appreciate the time, and we'll chat again here, I'm sure, on LinkedIn.
Cool. Thanks.
All right.